5:40 in the morning, Bay Village, Ohio. The phone rings in Mayor Spencer Houk's bedroom. He picks it up. The voice on the other end is his friend, a neurosurgeon, 30 years old. The voice is shaking. The voice says 7 words. My God, Spence, get over here quick. I think they have killed Marilyn. Houk puts the phone down. He wakes his wife, Esther. They get in the car and drive 3 blocks to the Sheppard home. It is still dark. They do not know it yet, but they are about to walk into a crime scene that will change American law forever. A crime scene with 1 victim, 1 suspect, and a 7-year-old boy sleeping in the next room. It is the morning of July 4th, 1954. And what happened inside that house on the shore of Lake Erie will not be fully understood for another 44 years, if it is ever understood at all. This is the case of Marilyn Sheppard, the case that inspired The Fugitive, the case that sent a doctor to prison for a murder the evidence suggests he may not have committed, and the case that let the man who may have actually done it walk free for decades, free to kill again. To understand what happened that night, you need to start earlier. You need to start with who Marilyn Sheppard was, because before she became a name on a police report, before she became the center of a media storm that would consume Cleveland for the rest of that year, she was a woman who taught Sunday school at Bay, Methodist Church, a mother, a wife, a woman who was, at the time of her death, 4 months pregnant with her second child, a boy. Marilyn Reese had met Sam Sheppard in junior high school. They dated through high school, then through college. They married in February of 1945. She was 21 years old. By the summer of 1954, Sam was a successful osteopathic neurosurgeon at Bayview Hospital, a hospital his own father had founded. Marilyn raised their son. They had 1 child together, a boy named Samuel, though everyone called him Chip. Chip was 7 years old. They lived in a 2-story house on the shore of Lake Erie, in a suburb where the mayor lived 3 blocks away, where your family doctor came to dinner, and where the man who washed your windows had a key to your back door. The Sheppards had a dog, a beagle named Coco. Chip loved that dog. Remember the dog. You will need to. On the evening of July 3rd, a Saturday, the Sheppards hosted their neighbors Don and Nancy Ahern for dinner. The 2 families sat on the screen porch and watched the sun set over the lake. Don Ahern took his 2 children home, put them to bed, and drove back. Marilyn tucked Chip into his upstairs bedroom. The 2 couples watched a movie on one of the 2 available television channels. The movie was called Strange Holiday. Marilyn sat on Sam's lap until Sam, tired from a long day in the emergency room, moved to the daybed in the living room and fell asleep. The Aherns left a little after midnight. Marilyn showed them to the door. This is the last time anyone would see Marilyn Sheppard alive, except for one person. Somewhere between 3 and 5 in the morning, Marilyn was attacked in her upstairs bedroom. She was struck 27 times in the face and head. The weapon was never found. The killer did not stop. The medical examiner would later determine her time of death at approximately 4:30 in the morning. Chip slept through the entire thing. The 7-year-old boy in the next room did not hear his mother die. Something else did not happen that night. The dog did not bark. Coco, the family beagle, was in the house. Coco was known to bark at strangers. Every dog does. That is what dogs are for. But on the night Marilyn Sheppard was killed, nobody, not Chip upstairs, not the Aherns 2 blocks away, heard a single sound from that dog. Dogs bark at people they don't know. They don't bark at people they do. Hold on to that. The first police officer to arrive at the Sheppard home was a patrolman named Fred Drinkon. He got there around 6 in the morning. What he saw, he would spend the rest of his career trying to describe. Marilyn was on her bed. Her face was turned toward the door. Her pajama top had been pulled up. Her pajama bottom had been pulled off from one leg. The walls of the bedroom were covered in blood. The closet door, the pillow, the sheets. It looked, as one neighbor would later put it, like someone had stood in the middle of the room with a can of red paint and flicked it all around. Sam Sheppard was downstairs, shirtless, sitting in a swivel chair in his study, holding his neck. He was, in his own later words, a little fuzzy. He told Drenkan a story. He had fallen asleep on the couch downstairs. He had heard Marilyn scream his name. He had run upstairs. He had seen what he called a form standing over his wife, a white form, bushy-haired. He had fought the form. He had been struck on the back of the neck. He had lost consciousness. When he woke up, he checked Chip's room. Chip was safe. Chip was still sleeping. He ran back downstairs. He saw the form again running out the back door toward the lake. He chased it. They fought again on the beach. Sam was knocked out a second time. When he came to, it was almost dawn. His t-shirt was gone. His watch was gone. His feet were in the water. It was a strange story. It had always been a strange story. The police did not believe it. By 8 in the morning, the Cuyahoga County coroner, a man named Sam Gerber, had arrived at the house. Gerber listened to Drenkan's report. He walked through the bedroom. He looked at the body, and within an hour, Gerber had made a decision that would shape the next 6 decades of this case. A detective standing nearby overheard him say it out loud. "It's obvious," Gerber said, "that the doctor did it." Gerber had not yet interviewed Sam. He had not yet processed evidence. He had not yet examined fingerprints or blood samples. He had been at the crime scene for less than 60 minutes. And from that moment on, the investigation into Marilyn Sheppard's murder would have one goal, not to find her killer, to convict her husband. I want you to understand something before we continue. This is not a story about a bad man getting away with murder. This is a story about a system, the police, the coroner, the prosecutors, the press, the judges deciding what was true, and then making everything else fit that decision. The story that would emerge in the Cleveland newspapers over the next 3 weeks was not a story about evidence. It was a story about a man, a handsome doctor, a bored husband, a secret life. And there was a secret. The police found it quickly. Her name was Susan Hayes. Susan Hayes was a 24-year-old lab technician at Bayview Hospital. She had met Sam Sheppard in 1951 when she did lab work for his emergency calls. By the time of Marilyn's death, she and Sam had been having an affair for over 2 years. When police first asked Sam about Susan Hayes, he lied. He said they were good friends, nothing more. It was a lie. It was the lie that would convict him, because Coroner Gerber now had what he needed: not a murder weapon, not a witness, not forensic evidence, a motive. The theory was simple. Sam wanted out of his marriage. Marilyn was pregnant and refusing to let him go, so Sam killed her, bludgeoned her 27 times. There were problems with this theory. There were always problems with this theory, but the Cleveland Press did not care about the problems. And the editor of the Cleveland Press did not care whether Sam Sheppard got a fair trial. The editor's name was Louis Seltzer. And within 3 weeks of Marilyn's death, Louis Seltzer was running the show. On July 21st, the morning edition of the Cleveland Press ran a front page editorial. The headline was 4 words: "Why no inquest? Do it now, Dr. Gerber." By that afternoon, the same day, Gerber had called an inquest. That is how fast the press was moving this case. Editorial in the morning. Public inquiry that afternoon. The inquest was held in a high school gymnasium. They had to use a gymnasium because so many people, reporters, photographers, radio crews, television crews, and several hundred curious citizens wanted to watch. Sam Sheppard was forced to answer questions for 3 days, still wearing a neck brace, still claiming injury from the night of the murder. His lawyer, William Corrigan, was not allowed to represent him. Corrigan was forced to watch from the bleachers. When Corrigan tried to object to the audience cheering for the coroner's questions, Gerber had him physically removed from the gymnasium. The mostly female crowd cheered as Sam Sheppard's attorney was dragged out. This was not a court, this was a show, and it was just beginning. While the police and the press were building their case against Sam, someone else was living a quiet life a few miles away. He was 25 years old. He owned a small company. He had cut himself, according to his own later statement, washing windows at the Sheppard home 2 days before Marilyn was killed. His name was Richard Eberling. Nobody was looking at Richard Eberling in July of 1954. Nobody would look at him for another 5 years. And by the time they did, it would be too late. Richard Eberling grew up without parents. He was an orphan of fact, he mentioned often, and with a bitterness that investigators would later recognize as something more than sadness. By 1954, he was running a small business called Dick's Window Cleaning. He went from house to house in the nice neighborhoods of Bay Village and Rocky River. He wore a clean uniform. He was polite. He did good work. He also paid attention. Eberling had a client list, and on that list were some of the wealthiest families in the suburb, including Marilyn and Sam Sheppard. By his own later account, he barely knew Sam, but Marilyn he knew. He would describe her to an interviewer decades later. She had that California look, he said, tight little shorts, a very little blouse. She was immaculate, all in white. He remembered her. He had spent time with her. He had eaten brownies with her son in her kitchen. He knew the layout of her house. He knew the main door. He knew the side door. And he knew about the basement entrance, a small cellar door that most neighbors did not even realize existed. The dog would have known him too. Coco had watched Richard Eberling walk through that house dozens of times. Eberling was not a stranger. Coco did not bark at Eberling. Coco would never bark at Eberling. Remember that. Eberling's life had two sides. On the outside, he was a young businessman trying to climb. On the inside, he was something else. He stole things, small things at first, cash from houses he worked in, jewelry from drawers. He was careful. He was patient. He wore two Ps. Even as a young man, a detail that would matter later. He would later tell an interviewer, speaking about himself in the third person, a habit she found strange. Richard always looks to tomorrow. Richard feels the streets are littered with gold. All one has to do is stoop over and pick it up. 5 years after Marilyn Sheppard's murder, a client of Eberling's would report money missing from her home. She would name Eberling as the likely thief. The police would search his house. They would find cash. They would find jewelry. They would find, among many other things, a cocktail ring, a ring that had belonged to Marilyn Sheppard. On a hunch, an officer would ask Eberling a strange question. Why was your blood found inside the Sheppard home? His blood had not actually been found. The officer was bluffing. Eberling's answer would become one of the most important moments in the entire case. I cut my hand, Eberling said, washing windows there. 2 days before the murder, I dripped blood throughout the house. It was a confession wrapped inside an alibi. Because if Eberling had been inside the Sheppard home 2 days before Marilyn was killed bleeding, as he now claimed then, any of his blood found at the crime scene could be explained away easily, conveniently. He had just given the police a pre-built defense. The police asked him to take a lie detector test. He agreed. On November 19th, 1959, Richard Eberling sat for a polygraph. He was asked whether he had killed Marilyn Sheppard. He said no. The machine showed no signs of deception. He was cleared. His name was removed from consideration in the Sheppard case. And then something happened that almost nobody knows about. Coroner Sam Gerber, the same coroner who had walked into the Sheppard house on July 4th and decided the doctor did it personally, ordered the police to drop any further investigation into Richard Eberling. The Cuyahoga County prosecutor, John Corrigan, backed him up. The two men who had built the case against Sam Sheppard 5 years earlier did not want anyone else to be investigated, because if anyone else was the killer, they had been wrong. And Coroner Gerber did not like being wrong, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before Richard Eberling was cleared in 1959, Sam Sheppard had already been tried, convicted, sentenced. His family had already been destroyed. And the trial that did all of that, the trial that sent him to prison, would eventually be called something remarkable by a federal judge: a mockery of justice. Those were the exact words the judge used: a mockery of justice. The trial of Sam Sheppard began on October 18th, 1954. It opened in the Cleveland courtroom of a 70-year-old judge named Edward Blythin. Blythin was up for re-election the following year. He was not a man who wanted to lose a case like this. Before the trial even began, something happened that almost nobody knew about for nearly a decade. A celebrity journalist had flown in from New York to cover the case. Her name was Dorothy Kilgallen. She was a syndicated columnist and one of the stars of the popular television quiz show, What's My Line? Kilgallen was pulled into Judge Blythin's chambers during a break in jury selection. She was expecting the usual pleasantries. What she got instead was a shock. The judge leaned in. He told her that in his opinion, the case was open and shut. And then he said 5 words that should have ended his career. He's guilty as hell. The judge, the man responsible for ensuring a fair trial, had already decided the verdict before the jury was even seated. Dorothy Kilgallen understood exactly what had just happened. She also understood that the conversation was off the record. She kept the judge's words a secret. She kept them secret through the entire 9-week trial. She kept them secret through the conviction. She kept them secret through Sam's years in prison. She did not reveal what Blythin had said until nearly a decade later, after the judge himself had died. Had she reported it at the time, Blythin would have been removed from the case. Sam Sheppard's trial would have been thrown out, but she didn't. And so the trial proceeded with a judge who had already made up his mind. This was only the beginning of what the Supreme Court would later call the carnival atmosphere of Sheppard's trial. Judge Blythin denied defense motions to move the trial out of Cleveland, where the Cleveland press had spent 3 months calling for Sam's arrest. He denied motions to delay the trial until publicity died down. The jury was not sequestered. Their names, their photos, and their home addresses were published in the Cleveland papers more than 40 times. Think about that, 40 times. Jurors received letters about the case. They received phone calls. Friends and neighbors told them what they thought. A false national news report claimed that a woman in New York had come forward saying she had an illegitimate child with Sam Sheppard. 2 jurors heard this report. The defense asked Judge Blythin to question the jury about whether they had heard it. Blythin refused. His exact words were, "It is a matter of free speech. We are not going to harass the jury every morning. The woman in New York did not exist. The report was fabricated, but the damage had been done." The courtroom itself was transformed. A long table was set up inside the bar, the area usually reserved for lawyers and the accused, and filled with reporters. The jury box was within arm's reach of the press. Every whispered conversation between Sam and his attorneys could be overheard. Nothing was private. Nothing was protected. The prosecution's star witness was Coroner Sam Gerber himself. Gerber took the stand and showed the jury a pillowcase stained with Marilyn's blood. He pointed to a shape in the bloodstain. He told the jury under oath that he could see the imprint of a surgical instrument. A surgical instrument. The murder weapon, Gerber suggested the weapon that was never found had been a surgical tool. And what profession routinely handled surgical tools? A neurosurgeon, like Sam Sheppard. It was a brilliant piece of theater. It was also, as would be proven years later, completely false. No such surgical instrument exists. Gerber, under cross-examination 12 years later, would be forced to admit he had searched all over the United States for a surgical tool that matched the bloodstain. He would admit he could not find one because there wasn't one. But in 1954, the jury did not know that. They saw the bloody pillow. They heard the coroner, a man in a suit, a professional doctor, tell them it was the mark of a surgical instrument. And they started to believe. The prosecution's other trump card was Susan Hayes, the lab technician with whom Sam had been having an affair. She was flown back from California. She took the stand. In a flat, careful voice, she described the intimate details of her 2-year relationship with Dr. Sheppard. Every encounter, every hotel stay, every lie Sam had told his wife. When Sam took the stand in his own defense, he was not a sympathetic figure. He was arrogant. He was distant. He used clinical language when emotional language was needed. He had visualized the intruder, he said, rather than seen him. He had been stimulated to run upstairs rather than alarmed. He sounded to the jury like a man reciting a rehearsed story. He sounded like a man who was lying. On December 21st, 1954, after deliberating for 4.5 days, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty of murder in the second degree, Sam Sheppard was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. And then the real damage began. 17 days after the verdict, on January 7th, 1955, Sam's mother, Ethel Niles Sheppard, committed suicide. She had been unable to bear what had happened to her son. 11 days after that, on January 18th, Sam's father died, officially of stomach cancer, in reality of grief. Both of Sam Sheppard's parents were dead within 3 weeks of his conviction. Chip, who was 8 years old, would be raised by his Uncle Stephen and Aunt Betty. 8 years later, in February of 1963, Marilyn's own father, Thomas Reese, would also die by suicide. He had never recovered from believing his son-in-law had killed his daughter. 3 suicides, 2 grief deaths, 1 family effectively erased. And Marilyn's killer, whoever he was still out there. Sam Sheppard would spend the next 10 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary. He worked in the prison hospital. He read every book could find. He waited. His case was appealed and appealed and appealed. Every appeal was denied. Then, in 1961, his lawyer, William Corrigan, suffered a stroke and died. Sam needed a new attorney. His brother, Stephen, reached out to a young, brash Boston lawyer who had been reading about the case. His name was F. Lee Bailey. He was 28 years old. Bailey would later become one of the most famous defense attorneys in American history. He would defend the heiress, Patty Hearst. He would be part of the so-called dream team that defended O.J. Simpson. But in 1961, he was a nobody with one big case, and he took it. Bailey believed that Sam Sheppard had been denied a fair trial, not because the evidence was flawed, though he believed that too, but because the entire proceeding had been corrupted by the press. He filed a federal habeas corpus petition. He argued that the media coverage in 1954 had violated Sam's constitutional rights. In July of 1964, a federal district judge agreed. Judge Carl Weinman wrote a decision that used the language that would define this case forever. He called the 1954 trial, and I am quoting the federal court record here, a mockery of justice. A mockery of justice. Those words again, the ruling ordered Sam Sheppard released within 60 days unless the state brought new charges. Sam walked out of prison. He had been inside for 10 years. He was 40 years old. His parents were dead. His wife was dead. His son, Chip, was now 17, nearly a stranger. 3 days after his release, Sam married a German woman named Ariane Tebenjohans. She had been writing him letters in prison. She was wealthy. She was beautiful. She was also, in a detail, the press would immediately discover the half-sister of the wife of Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda chief. That is not a joke. Sam Sheppard's second wife was connected by marriage to Hitler's inner circle. This is a true story. Sam's freedom was short-lived. The state of Ohio appealed. The Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals reinstated his conviction. But Bailey was not done. He took the case to the highest court in the land. In February of 1966, Sheppard v. Maxwell was argued before the Supreme Court of the United States. On June 6, 1966, the court issued its ruling. 8 justices to 1. Justice Tom C. Clark wrote the majority opinion. He used words that would be quoted in law schools for the next 60 years. He called the 1954 trial a carnival atmosphere. He described how reporters had sat within feet of the jury, how jurors' names had been published over 40 times, how the judge had refused to sequester them, how the press had reported information that was never introduced in court. He wrote that the massive, pervasive, and prejudicial publicity had made a fair trial impossible. The conviction was reversed. Sam Sheppard was released for the second time, and the case, Sheppard versus Maxwell, became the legal foundation for every gag order, every sequestered jury, every change of venue motion in American courts for the next 60 years. Every time a judge today limits what the press can report about a pending criminal case, they are following a rule written because of what happened to Sam Sheppard. Every time a high-profile defendant's trial is moved to a different city to find an unbiased jury, that is because of Sheppard v. Maxwell. 30 years later, when F. Lee Bailey would walk into a courtroom in Los Angeles to defend O.J. Simpson, he would cite the case he had won for Sam Sheppard, but none of that mattered to Sam Sheppard in October of 1966. What mattered was that he was going to be tried again. And this time, Bailey was going to do what William Corrigan had not done in 1954. This time, the defense was going to be about the evidence. The second trial began on October 24th, 1966. Judge Francis Talty presided. Talty was not Judge Blythin. He banned reporters from most of the courtroom. He imposed strict rules on what could be published. He sequestered the jury. The carnival was over. Bailey built his defense around one man, Dr. Paul Leland Kirk, a California criminalist, a forensic scientist. Kirk had examined the crime scene back in 1955, months after the murder, after the house had been unsealed. He had found things the prosecution had missed. He had found blood in Marilyn's bedroom that did not match Sam. It did not match Marilyn either. It came from a third person, someone whose blood should not have been in that room at all. Kirk testified to this in 1966. The jury heard for the first time that the blood evidence did not fit the prosecution's theory. Kirk also demonstrated that the pattern of blood spatter around Marilyn's body suggested the killer had been left-handed. Sam Sheppard was right-handed. If the killer was left-handed and Sam was right-handed, then Sam could not be the killer. The jury was not told to accept this as fact. They were shown the physics. Bailey did not put Sam on the stand this time. He had studied the 1954 transcripts. He knew Sam's clinical, arrogant style had hurt him. Instead, Bailey let the evidence speak. He closed his argument with one line. The real killer, he told the jury, is not in this courtroom. On November 16th, 1966, the jury deliberated for less than a day. The first vote was 8-4 for acquittal. By evening, the minority had come around. Sam Sheppard was found not guilty. 12 years, 4 months, and 13 days. After his wife was killed, he was a free man. But he was not an innocent man. Not legally. Not guilty is not the same as innocent. Not guilty means the state has failed to prove its case. It does not mean the defendant did not do it. It means the evidence was not strong enough. That distinction would haunt Sam Sheppard for the rest of his life. And the rest of his life was not long. He got his medical license back. He tried to return to surgery. 2 of his patients died on his operating table. He was sued. He quit medicine. His hands, his colleagues said, had been shaking for years. His second marriage collapsed. Ariane filed for divorce in 1968, citing infidelity and what she described as threats. Sam had never been a violent man, but he had become a volatile one. Prison had done something to him. In 1969, Sam Sheppard did something that no one who had known him in his previous life could have predicted. He became a professional wrestler. He chose a stage name. He called himself, and I am not making this up, Killer Sheppard, Killer. The man whose entire life had been defined by a murder he said he did not commit now walked into the ring each week and wore the name of the thing he had been accused of. He married his wrestling manager's 20-year-old daughter. He drank heavily. He took pills. He shoplifted. He fell apart. On April 6th, 1970, Sam Sheppard collapsed in the kitchen of his home. He was vomiting blood. Paramedics could not revive him. The cause of death was liver failure brought on by years of heavy alcohol use. He was 46 years old. He died believing no one would ever know the truth about what happened to Marilyn. He died believing the system that had destroyed him would never admit it had been wrong. He died without justice. And as far as he knew, he died without any hope of justice. He did not know about Richard Eberling because by 1970, Richard Eberling had done very well for himself. He had served a minor sentence for the larceny charges from 1959. And then he had transformed. Through a business partner, he had gotten close to Cleveland's mayor. He had become an interior decorator for the city's social elite. In 1973, he won the contract to restore Cleveland's historic city hall. He was hosting parties. He was photographed with politicians. He was by any outward measure success. The window washer who had once dripped blood in the Sheppard home, by his own admission, was now a wealthy man. And nobody was asking any more questions about a murder that had happened 19 years earlier. Nobody was thinking about Marilyn Sheppard, except for one person. That person was Sam Reese Sheppard, Chip, the 7-year-old boy who had slept through his mother's murder. By 1970, when his father died, Chip was 23 years old. He had grown up without a mother. He had grown up visiting his father in prison. He had grown up reading headlines about his own family in the Cleveland papers. And he had grown up with a single, unshakable belief his father had not killed his mother. He did not know who had, but he knew it was not Sam. And he was going to prove it or die trying. It would take him the rest of his life. He would, in the end, die without ever getting a final answer. For the first 2 decades after his father's death, Chip lived quietly. He became a dental hygienist. He married. He tried to have a normal life. But the case would not leave him alone. Neither were the letters. People wrote to him from all over the country. Some were cranks, some were not. In July of 1989, something happened that changed everything. A man named Richard Eberling went on trial in Lakewood, Ohio, for the aggravated murder of an elderly widow named Ethel Mae Durkin. Durkin had been Eberling's employer. He had been her nurse's aide. He had inserted himself into her life. He had rewritten her will, and then she had died. Officially, Durkin died after a fall in her home. Eberling had called paramedics. He had identified himself as her nephew, which he was not. The medical evidence suggested she had been lying injured for hours before the call was made. The investigation that began as insurance fraud became a murder investigation. Eberling was convicted, life in prison, and as soon as the verdict came down, Sheppard recognized the name Richard Eberling, the window washer, the man who had been caught with his mother's ring in 1959, the man who had been cleared by a polygraph and forgotten. Chip began to wonder. Something else had also happened, something that Chip would not learn about until years later. In 1962, just 3 years after Eberling had been cleared in the Sheppard case, an elderly woman named Myrtle, Irene Frey, had been beaten to death in her home. She was 64 years old. Myrtle Frey was the sister of Ethel May Durkin, the same Ethel May Durkin that Eberling would later kill. Frey's murder was never solved. It is still unsolved. Today, the method of Frey's killing, beaten to death in her bed, was, many investigators would later note, strikingly similar to what had happened to Marilyn Sheppard. In March of 1990, Chip Sheppard drove to the Lebanon Correctional Institution in Ohio. He had requested a meeting with Richard Eberling. Eberling had agreed. They sat across from each other, the son of the woman who had been murdered, and the man who Chip was beginning to believe had killed her. They talked for hours. Eberling was strange. He referred to himself in the third person. Richard thinks this, and Richard does that. He denied killing Marilyn, but he knew details about the case that he should not have known, and he seemed to enjoy the attention. Over the next few years, Chip Sheppard partnered with an author and investigative journalist named Cynthia Cooper. Together, they began a deep re-examination of the Sheppard case. They tracked down old witnesses. They read old files. They looked at evidence that had been ignored for 3 decades, and they found things. One of the things they found was a scientific investigation unit report that had never been disclosed by the prosecution. The report documented evidence of forced entry through the basement door of the Sheppard home. The prosecution had argued for months that there had been no break-in, but there had been, through a door that most neighbors didn't even know existed. A door that Richard Eberling, the window washer, had certainly known about. In 1993, Chip and Cooper hired a private investigation firm, AMSEC. The firm produced a report concluding that the physical evidence was consistent with an intruder, just as Sam Sheppard had claimed. 40 years after the murder, someone was finally taking Sam's story seriously. Their findings were published in 1995 in a book called Mockery of Justice. The title, of course, came from the federal judge's 1964 ruling. The book made the case for the first time in print that Richard Eberling had killed Marilyn Sheppard. By this point, something had also started to change in Eberling himself. He was in prison for life. He had nothing left to lose, and he began to talk. Not openly, not directly, but in fragments, in hints, in sentences that could be interpreted in more than one way. A former nurse who had worked for Ethel May Durkin came forward in April of 1996. Her name was Kathy Collins Dial. She told investigators that Eberling had admitted to her in a private conversation that he had killed Marilyn Sheppard. When questioned, Eberling denied making the statement, but Dial was firm. She had no reason to lie. Eberling himself, in interviews with Cynthia Cooper, said things that sounded close to admissions. When asked what he would like to be remembered for, he said, "Actually, nothing. I'd like to dry up and go away. I'd like to be remembered for good things." When asked about Marilyn Sheppard, he said, "Marilyn had trouble up till the day she died. She was a lovely lady, a very fine lady, very respectable. I think she was lonesome because she let a lot of family dirt out to me. To me, he had said to me, as if they had been close, as if she had confided in him, a window washer she saw a few times a year, as if he had been inside her life in a way she would not have welcomed had she known how he thought about her. And then there was this. When Cooper asked Eberling about a specific rape allegation, not the Sheppard case, a different incident, he said something that she wrote down, word for word, and later published. If she paraded for him like she paraded, for me, Eberling said, she asked for it. She was all dolled up in the middle of the afternoon for the window washer, put on all that feminine charm. The window washer himself, speaking about himself, by 1997, Chip Sheppard had filed a civil lawsuit against the state of Ohio. He wanted his father officially declared innocent. The stakes were not just personal. If Sam was declared wrongfully imprisoned, the family would be entitled to compensation from the state. But more than that, Chip wanted his mother's case reopened. He wanted the real killer, whom he now believed was Eberling, to be held accountable. And for the first time in the history of the Sheppard case, modern science was going to be applied to the evidence, DNA testing. In the 1950s, DNA had not yet been understood as a forensic tool. Blood typing was the best technology available. But by the late 1990s, DNA analysis could identify individuals with near certainty from samples as small as a single drop of dried blood. The key question was whether any usable DNA survived on the evidence from the 1954 crime scene. Blood samples had been preserved. So had Sam Sheppard's trousers. So had vaginal swabs taken from Marilyn Sheppard during her autopsy, swabs that, for reasons never explained, had never been tested. In September of 1997, Sam Sheppard's body was exhumed. A DNA sample was taken. It was sent to a laboratory in Indianapolis. The lead scientist was Dr. Mohammad Tahir, the supervisor of DNA and serology at the Indianapolis-Marion County Forensic Services Agency. Tahir ran his tests. He compared Sam's DNA to the DNA in the blood from the crime scene. He did the same with Richard Eberling's DNA, which had been taken by court order while Eberling sat in prison. On March 4th, 1998, Tahir's results were announced. The blood trail from Marilyn's bedroom leading down to the basement did not come from Sam Sheppard. It came from someone whose DNA was consistent with Richard Eberling. The blood spot on the closet door, 1 foot from where Marilyn was killed, did not come from Sam. It did not come from Marilyn. It came from someone whose DNA was consistent with Richard Eberling. The blood smear found on Sam Sheppard's own trousers, the blood that the prosecution had spent months insisting came from Marilyn, did not come from Marilyn. It came from someone whose DNA was consistent with Richard Eberling. And then there was the test nobody had expected. The vaginal swabs, the ones taken from Marilyn's body during her autopsy 43 years earlier and never tested. Tahir ran DNA analysis on them. He found semen, and the semen, according to Tahir, was consistent with the DNA profile of Richard Eberling. Terry Gilbert, the Sheppard family's lawyer, chose his words carefully when he made the announcement public. Richard Eberling, he said, cannot be excluded as a suspect. The bottom line is, Eberling shows up everywhere with his DNA. On the closet wall, on the blood trail going down to the basement, on the porch, on Sheppard's trousers, and possibly inside Marilyn's body. 44 years later, science had answered a question that the courts never had, except science did not answer it completely. DNA analysis in 1997 was not as precise as it is today. Tahir's conclusion was that the DNA was consistent with Eberling's, not that it was definitely his. The defense could argue and would argue that other people shared the same DNA markers. And there was one uncomfortable fact that Chip Sheppard's team had to address. Eberling had type A blood. And no type A blood had been identified in Marilyn's bedroom during the original investigation. The defense said the original blood typing had missed it. The prosecution said it hadn't. The jury in the civil trial would eventually have to choose whom to believe, but all of that was still to come. First, Eberling himself had to die. On July 25th, 1998, 4 months and 3 weeks after the DNA results were announced, Richard Eberling died in prison of illness. He was 67 years old. He had never been charged with the murder of Marilyn Sheppard. He would never stand trial for it. But before he died, he said things. One fellow inmate, a man named Robert Lee Parks, at the Orient Correctional Institution, came forward on August 19th, 1998, shortly after Eberling's death. Parks said that Eberling had confessed to him in their last conversations that he had killed Marilyn Sheppard. Secondhand prison confessions are not the strongest evidence in the world. A jury would be right to be skeptical of them, but this was not the only thing Eberling had said, not even close. To an investigative journalist named James Neff, who spent years interviewing Eberling and would later publish a book called The Wrong Man, Eberling made a statement that coming from anyone else might be meaningless. Coming from him, it was chilling. Eberling described the scene he had found in Marilyn Sheppard's bedroom. My God, he said, I had never seen anything like it. I got out of there. Not I heard about it. Not I saw pictures of it. I got out of there. As if he had been inside it. As if he had himself left that room covered in blood. And then there was the sentence that Eberling said to Cynthia Cooper near the end of his life. It is the sentence that, if he was the killer, was the closest thing to a confession he ever gave. And it is the sentence that, if he was not the killer, was the cruelest thing he could have said. The Sheppard answer, Eberling said, is in front of the entire world. Nobody bothered to look. The Sheppard answer is in front of the entire world. Nobody bothered to look. He took whatever he meant by that to his grave. The civil trial that Chip Sheppard had fought for Davis v. State of Ohio began on January 31st, 2000. It lasted 8 weeks. The jury heard everything: the DNA, the confessions, the scientific investigation unit report, the basement door, the ring. They also heard the state's case. Lawyers for Ohio argued that the 1954 jury had been right. They argued that the physical evidence, properly understood, still pointed to Sam. They argued that the murder weapon had not been a flashlight, as the defense suggested, but a lamp that had been missing from the Sheppard bedroom. On April 12, 2000, the civil jury returned its verdict. They sided with the state of Ohio. Sam Sheppard was not declared innocent. The family would receive no compensation. 6 of the 8 jurors told reporters afterward that they believed Sam had killed Marilyn. 3 juries, 3 verdicts. 1954 said guilty. 1966 said not guilty. 2000 said, we don't know, and if we had to guess, we'd still say Sam did it. 2 years later, in 2002, Chip Sheppard died. He was 55 years old. He did not live to see any further resolution in the case. He did not live to see his mother's killer publicly named. He did not live to see his father officially exonerated. He had spent the last 46 years of his life trying to rewrite the history of one night in his childhood, and he had not succeeded. He had also, quietly, not failed. He had made the world look. He had forced the DNA tests that raised doubts that will never be fully resolved. Because this is where the story sits today. Sam Sheppard is buried in Knollwood Cemetery in Cleveland. His second wife is elsewhere. Marilyn is there. So is the fetus their second son, who was exhumed alongside her for testing in 1999 and reburied. Chip is buried near them. Richard Eberling is buried in a prison cemetery. Coroner Sam Gerber is dead. Judge Edward Blythin is dead. Dorothy Kilgallen died in 1965 under circumstances that have their own conspiracy theories attached. Louis Seltzer, editor of the Cleveland Press, is dead. Everyone who could answer is gone. And the question, who killed Marilyn Sheppard, is still technically open. I want to tell you where I land on this case. I have read the trial transcripts. I have read the DNA reports. I have read the scientific investigation unit report that the prosecution hid. I have read Eberling's interviews. I have read the federal ruling that called the 1954 trial a mockery of justice. And I think the honest answer is this: we will never know with complete certainty who killed Marilyn Sheppard, but we know with absolute certainty that the system designed to answer that question failed. Twice, maybe 3 times. It failed Marilyn first. When Coroner Gerber decided the doctor did it within an hour of arriving at the crime scene, it failed her. Second, when Richard Eberling was cleared in 1959, and Gerber personally ordered the investigation dropped, it may have failed her a third time in 2000 when a civil jury looked at the DNA and decided it didn't matter. Justice for Marilyn Sheppard never came, not in 1954, not in 1966, not in 1998, not in 2000, and now more than 70 years after her death, it never will. Everyone who did this, if it was more than one person, is dead. Everyone who should have stopped it is dead. Everyone who could confess is dead. There is one witness left, and he never said a word. The dog, Coco, the family beagle who was inside the house on the night of July 4th, 1954. The dog who, for whatever reason, did not bark. The dog who would have barked at a stranger. The dog who did not bark that night. Whoever walked through that house at 3 or 4 in the morning, whoever climbed those stairs, whoever stood in that bedroom, whoever struck Marilyn Sheppard 27 times was not a stranger to that dog. The dog knew him. And the dog, I keep coming back to that. Out of all the evidence in this case, the DNA, the blood stains, the polygraphs, the confessions, the inquests, the Supreme Court rulings, I keep coming back to the dog because the dog was the only witness who had no reason to lie, no trial to win, no career to save, no re-election to consider. The dog just knew. And the dog stayed quiet. And what the dog knew, the dog took with him. There is one last thing I want to leave you with. It is not about Sam. It is not about Eberling. It is about Marilyn. Marilyn Reese Sheppard was 31 years old. She taught Sunday school. She had one son she adored. She was 4 months pregnant with another. She had met her husband in junior high school. She had married him at 21. She had built a life. She was killed in her own bed in her own home, a few feet from the room where her 7-year-old son was sleeping. Whoever did, it was someone who had been inside that house before, someone the family dog knew, someone familiar. That person has never been held accountable, not in a courtroom, not in a prison cell, not in any way the law would recognize. That person died free, and Marilyn Sheppard is still buried in Knollwood Cemetery under a stone that does not say how she died, only that she lived and that she is loved. That is the only final verdict this case will ever have.